People have been doing something like this in Cobham for more than 1,000 years. The objective has never changed: to make use of the natural energy contained in the River Mole. By focusing the flow of the water onto paddles mounted on a large wheel, the natural progression of the river towards the sea produces a rotary movement powerful enough to help feed the local community. We know that types of bread were being eaten in Egypt and the Middle East long before the birth of Christ. But before the days of mills like Cobham's, cutting through the hard outer shells of the grain grown in the local fields and releasing the flour inside meant hard manual work or using animal power. Establishing a successful mill could transform a community, and it's clear that Cobham, standing alongside its small but potentially powerful river, found itself in an ideal position. It was almost certainly the Romans who brought the idea of mechanical milling to England. The Domesday Book tells us that this corner of Surrey may have had 3 watermills working at the time of William the Conqueror, and we know that by the Middle Ages, one was almost certainly in operation on this site. The mill we have today was established in the 1820s and was originally part of a much larger structure that extended over what is now the main road to Leatherhead. It boasted one of the widest waterwheels in the country. For 100 years, local farmers brought their harvest to the larger mill to be ground into flour for sale and local baking. The smaller building nearer the river was originally a grist mill. It produced a meal coarser than flour, used as animal feed. The last flour was milled here commercially in the 1920s, the business killed off by large steel roller mills located mainly at seaports to grind imported grain, because bakers had come to prefer the hard durum wheats of the New World. For the next 30 years, Cobham's Mill was used as a shop and a store, until the early 1950s, when the Highways Authority decided that this restriction on the town's burgeoning road traffic had to be demolished. The old grist mill became Cobham's only reminder of what had once been central to the supply of food to the community. The fact that we still have a mill in Cobham, and that it can demonstrate the ingenuity of a technology that dates back many centuries, owes everything to a number of local groups who over the years have determined that this unique piece of history shall not be lost. It was in the 1960s that Cobham experienced what many locals call architectural vandalism. Long-established buildings in the High Street were torn down to be replaced with functional, but what was seen as less attractive, concrete-framed shops and homes. Determined to defend what was left of the town's characteristic architecture, a local conservation group was formed, and whilst there was much to do elsewhere in the town, it was quickly realised that time was running out for Cobham's Mill. In the 1970s, groups of young volunteers, including some local scouts guided by their enthusiastic leader, took on the job of clearing the trees and shrubs that had taken over the channel where the powerful wheels had once stood. But there was a more substantial problem to be faced. The power of the river that had once driven the mill now threatened to destroy it. The strong currents and eddies of the mole were undermining the building, eating into its foundations and threatening to topple it into the river. By the late 80s, the conservationists had established a preservation trust dedicated to saving the mill, with the ambitious aim of returning it to working order so that generations to come could again experience the efficient way the community had fed itself for more than 1,000 years. It was not an easy task. For a time, it seemed as if the last group of people the county council who now owned the building wanted to see taking responsibility for the mill was the Preservation Trust. And all the while, the waters of the mole continued to threaten the fabric of the building. The government's various rivers agencies proved to be a major source of support, and once it was clear that the trust had the commitment to restore the mill, even if it might not yet have the resources, those officials responsible for the workings of the river agreed to rebuild Cobham's weirs as part of an improved flood protection scheme, and to underpin and protect the vulnerable structure of the mill. In itself, this was a major undertaking, but it left the job of restoration still to be done. However, Cobham proved to be the ideal place in which to find the volunteer talent, skills and experience to undertake that job. Amongst the locality's population of the recently retired, the Trust found some of the country's most experienced civil, mechanical, electrical and water engineers, all only too keen to focus their newly found free time on this exciting local project. Led by a distinguished man of the city who cut through bureaucracy as skillfully as his technical colleagues sorted out the structural challenges, Cobham Mill, a project which a national expert said in the late 80s would cost as much as £70,000 to reconstruct, was put back into full working order within 2 years at a cost of a little over £15,000. Commercial companies responded to the Trust's enthusiasm. Equipment was lent, specialist work was undertaken and never billed, but no one should doubt the enormity of the task that had to be done. Much of the original mechanical installation was still there, but it lay in an ill-disciplined heap in the bottom of the pit, or outside in the mill stream where it had fallen as its supporting structure had rotted and collapsed. What was left of the wider mill wheel, no longer needed now that the larger mill building had long gone, was retrieved from the mud and presented to Houghton Mill in Cambridgeshire. The rest of the parts were carefully collected, cleaned and repaired where necessary, whilst the architects on the Trust did research into how mills typically worked, and they drew up plans for how the pieces might fit together. The building had to be secured with appropriate bricks like the originals that may well have come from local brickworks like the one that once stood in nearby Oxshott. Traditional lime mortar ensured that the newly restored building would have the same natural flexibility enjoyed by the buildings of the 19th century. Much of the woodwork had to be completely rebuilt. The only carpentry that had to be commissioned from specialists outside the Trust was a set of special gear teeth crafted out of wood. These lightweight precision pieces are the traditional safety valve for the miller. Should the stones ever jam or the machinery run amok, the wooden teeth will break and the stones will stop turning. It was a closely guarded secret at the time, but some of the more substantial timber in the mill started life in Westminster Abbey. It found its way to Cobham when the abbey itself was being restored. The heavy collecting box that invites contributions from visitors was once part of the roof of Westminster Abbey. On the 13th of December 1992, the job was finished, and the Trust met in the mill together with a load of grain from the local landowner, who has generously supported the mill ever since, to test the quality of the restoration.
Oh, it's working now. It's grinding now.
That night, there was truly something to celebrate. For the first time in more than 60 years, Cobham Mill was producing flour again.
I think we nearly need another bag.
Here we are. Let me put that down.
Many of the original Preservation Trust are now retired. Some are no longer with us. And the responsibility of looking after this unique piece of local history is slowly passing to a new generation of volunteers. Here's what some of today's Cobham Millers feel about this place.
It is in itself worth preserving. It is a focal point of Cobham.
You can imagine the corn being brought in from farms in many areas around here, and it was the main source of industry, I'm sure.
This is history that moves and makes a noise. It grabs people's attention, and they're really interested to find that all this effort had to be gone into to produce flour.
And then you go into the background of where a mill fits into the rural landscape.
Children can only learn by hands-on. I think this is where I think it starts, really.
Whilst this is a minuscule proportion of life's education, it is nonetheless important.
Children love it. On top of that, it's a community project.
Perhaps you too have caught a sense of what it's like to be part of a project like this, welcoming visitors, sharing the timeless technology, helping in a variety of ways to secure the future of this special place. Thank you for visiting our mill, and if you'd like to offer a little of your time and energy to help here, do have a word with one of the guides. They were exciting times giving Cobham back its mill. Now, we want to make sure we don't ever lose it again.